Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com and also 92.1 WFOV. And we are very glad to be partnering with the radio station over there that's on University Drive, and they are doing some excellent work over there. I want to always bring into public view the visionary here in Flint, and that is none other than Paul Herring, who is he's truly a visionary in terms of things he's done in the community, and it just keeps on doing more and more things as far as making a contribution. And they're making a lot of they're making some very good inroads into the airways over there at the radio station. I want to commend him again for the fine job he's doing, and also those who are on that program, who are doing the programming over there. They seem to be on a roll. You become addicted really to the programs because you start listening, and you tend to do one program. Before you know it, you're spending 2 or 3 hours there. Because I don't listen to a lot of radio, but that's one radio station I do listen to, and they have some excellent programs. I want you to tune them in. We are doing our program as a addendum to the program here. We come on 92.1 at 12 o'clock on Saturdays, and want you to tune that program in at that time, and also the program that precedes it, Whose Opinion Is It Anyway? And that comes on 11 o'clock. They tape on Fridays at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and so they re-air it again at 11 o'clock on Saturdays. Very glad to be partnering with all of them, and I want you to stay tuned for the next hour here at allpointstv.com, because we are going to be talking about a couple of topics we think will pique your interest. It may seem like it's kind of disjointed a little bit, because we'll be talking about Dr. King, and believe it or not, and we're going to try to tie that in with a program that came on yesterday called Legend and Lies, which was dealing with the Civil War. And I also brought 3 books to the studio. One book called The Great Tax Wars, written by Stephen Weissman. The subtitle is Lincoln to Wilson, The Fierce Battles Over Money and Power That Transformed the Nation. A second book is a book written by Charles Adams. I've quoted this book before on the air, and this book is called Those Dirty Rotten Taxes. And I thought that would be very timely, since we had better get our taxes in to the rulers by the 17th of this month, or they're going to come for you. What's that song that says, what you're going to do, what you're going to do when they come for you? Bad boys, bad boys. And even if you're not a bad boy and you don't pay those taxes, they're coming for you. And so I brought this book, Those Dirty Rotten Taxes, which I want to tie in with the book called The South Was Right, which is written by the brothers, the twins, James Ronald Kennedy and Walter Donald Kennedy. And I'm going to start off with this book, The South Was Right. And I agree with these 2 writers. And when I mention that on some of these radio programs, and I take exception to this noise that we fought a civil war in this country, and this war that was fought between 1861 and 1865 was a war fought over slavery. I take exception to this nonsense that's being taught in these schools. And when I say that over the air, some of these brainwashed people have gone through these indoctrination centers, want to say that I'm making a fool out of myself by making these comments. They don't know the fools they've been made of by going to these indoctrination centers, learning this nonsense. When I say the South was right, and I agree with the Kennedy brothers, James Ronald Kennedy and Walter Donald Kennedy, I am not saying the South was right in terms of its enslavement of a population that was in this country from 1619, really before that, because the ones that came here before 1619 were indentured servants. Many of them had indentured themselves to come here. So in a sense, their condition was one of enslavement as well, at least for a period of time. The permanence of slavery, which starts in 1640 something, after the blacks had arrived here at Jamestown in 1619, coming 1 year before the Mayflower, which is a book written by Lerone Bennett called Before the Mayflower, and he dates this book 1619 to 1964. The slavery, when you say the South was right, people think we are talking about the South was right in terms of its enslavement of a part of its population, and that's not what the point is here. The South was right in terms of its exception to the taxation policies of the United States. And this war that was fought was one in which the whole Union, the soldiers out there on that battlefield, were turned into tax collectors. If you think this war was over slavery, I just have you to know that all you have to do to refute that nonsense is to go back and read the first inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln that was issued on Monday, March the 4th, 1861. And you read this inaugural address and then come and talk to me about whether or not there's anything in there about the ending of slavery when this inaugural address was issued 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. And then let's talk about it from the standpoint of what Lincoln said when he was in fact being installed into office, and 7 states at this time had succeeded from the Union, and see if there was anything other than the fact that they could not succeed from the Union according to what Lincoln was saying here in his inaugural address. And if they were going to have the slaves, they're going to have the slaves inside the Union, or they were in for a fight. I would challenge any of these historians or any of these pundits, political pundits, to prove, based on the documentation, that this war was anything other than a tax war, and a tax collection was what these persons on the battlefield were in fact doing. They had been turning them into tax collectors. The South was not going to be allowed to rebel against the tax collectors, and a 4-year war was fought in order to bring them to heel to the fact that those taxes were demanded and that they were due at a certain time, and if they were not paid, then you see what happened here in terms of military being used to bring that result about. If you say it was over anything other than that, then you got to prove your case by showing that in 1861, when this war was begun, that it was over the ending of slavery at that point in time. And you cannot do that based upon the dating of the war, which starts on April the 12th, 1861, with the firing of Fort Sumter, because as the South had succeeded, 7 states had succeeded at that point, and it would eventually be 11 states succeeding, but at that point 7 states had succeeded, one of which was South Carolina. And when they succeeded, and that means that Fort Sumter, which was in Charleston Harbor of South Carolina, was now on foreign soil, and refusing to surrender that fort to the seceding states that had now disunited from the Union, as they had every right to do, based upon the foundational moments of this country, where they ceded some of their authority and some of their sovereignty to the federal government in its creation. And having ceded some of their sovereignty to the federal government voluntarily, it meant then when it behooved them to take their sovereignty back, they could in fact do that. But under military duress and under the firepower of the Union, they were denied the right to do what they had every right to do under the Constitution at that point, because they didn't have the firepower to back it up, or making use of the Second Amendment, which is the right for them to bear arms and to defend themselves against what had occurred after the firing of Fort Sumter, which was the invasion of the South by the Northern soldiers. They were then picking up their weapons to defend themselves against the Northern encroachment, and that war lasted for 4 years, and the South eventually lost. When you say the South was right, it is not to say that slavery was right. And people need to stop being so brainwashed as to see them as equivalent scenarios in terms of saying the South was right, and then having the equivalent of saying that the slavery was right. To say the South was right, not to say that slavery was right, to say the South was right in terms of picking up his guns against the tax encroachers.
If you look at the history of the United States being so tied to England's history, English history, the founders and stuff like that, and then the people who came later, the founders' ideas probably were better represented, even in spite of slavery. Let me put that proviso in there. With that even in place, they are probably the Confederacy and the people of the Confederacy probably exemplified or represented the ideas of the founders far better than the people who were for the Union and stuff like that, because there's a lot of things that when I was a kid we always heard that the Union was the good guys, they wanted to go fight for fight to free the slaves, and it was a conceit that they actually encouraged in the public education system. And then but if you examine the guy named Weaver, he wrote a book called The South, basically about the South, and I forget his first name, but last name was Weaver, and basically he's saying the South was right on that too. I mean, they had more of a consistent basis to draw from than what the people who represented the Union could actually point to. More historic precedent, as well as our own founding documents. So they were right. They should have been able to retreat, to secede from the Union, and not. They just said, okay, we'll just make trade deals with them, whatever. But they didn't do that. The amount of force that Lincoln used, and the Union used was, over the top.
John, there was an article in the paper yesterday. Why Trump tariffs should matter to you, and if we understand this article, why Trump tariffs should matter to you in terms of the tariff that the Trump administration put on aluminum and steel, then you shouldn't have any problem understanding then what this war was about between 1861 and 1865. The article is talking about this tax. You could call it a tariff, but let's say tax here to make it more amenable to people's understanding of what's really going on. When you put a tariff in place, it is a insidious tax that's placed on the American people, and they have many ways of getting around how they are seizing the wealth of the people that have produced the wealth. The people have gone out and created, wealth and doing jobs that create wealth and things of that sort. They had how they seized the wealth in order to maintain the rebellion that would ensue if people understood how much of their wealth is being seized by these taxocrats. You call them Democrats. Give me a break. I'll give you another example. I'm getting ready. My birthday comes up in April, and I have to renew my tax. My tax. You have to you have to pay. If you have a car, you have to buy tax, or you have to have a license to drive your car on the streets of the rulers. And so on the, I brought to the studio, on the envelope, it says this: avoid late fees. Check the expiration date. That's in red, by the way. Avoid late fees. Check the expiration date. And the idea is that if you don't pay for your tax by the date of your birthday, by the time that your birthday comes up, then they say avoid late fees. Now, they don't call this avoid additional taxes. They got avoid late fees, so you're paying a fee here. What really it is that there is a tax in terms of you owning a car and driving it. You in other words, you paid taxes when you bought the car, And in order to drive the car after you have purchased it, with the taxes added on to the purchase of the car, then every year that you drive the car, you're paying additional taxes on the car that you own. And they call that, though, they call it license. So then, to avoid late fees, they want you to check the expiration date. In other words, my birthday is April the 13th. And so my expiration date is this month on the 13th, which is, I think, Friday of this month. And if I don't get the tax renewed by that time or pay the tax during that time, then there's an additional tax that's tacked onto the taxation of the tax, which they call it a fee, additional fee. They don't call it tax. Because you call every tax that they have. John, you mentioned this once before. When you were itemizing how many taxes we pay.
And that was just a partial list.
John, you could have gone all day with those taxes when you were mentioning one after the other.
We know the state of California, each county, I'm thinking it because I saw this a few years ago, I don't know if it's still, in each county they had different tax rates for the county.
Yeah.
I mean, absurd amounts, 10 or 12, 10, 11, 12% some of these were. I mean, in addition to the state tax, the federal tax, their income tax, they could pay all these other taxes. I mean, and what are you getting? More government. You're not getting a better quality of life. No, you're getting more bureaucrats.
The more tax you pay, the worse the government gets, because it allows the government to go into more insidious roles that it should not be playing based upon the enumeration of powers in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And their powers are delegated, the federal government's powers are delegated, and very specific in terms of the enumeration of what it can and cannot do. And they refuse to, in fact, hone into those limitations or accept it. And therefore they need more and more money to expand their power more and more, and they reach into our lives more and more, grabbing more of our liberties. And they need money to do that. And so we're now working, let's see, this is the 9th of April. So that means then that by the end of this month, we would have worked to pay our taxes to the rulers by the end of this month. It takes about 4 months for the American people to work enough to pay the taxes to all of the taxing agents in the country. And so the book called The South Was Right is talking not about slavery was right. They're saying the South was right in order to use its arms to defend itself, because when it stood up against taxation, then the question was, it runs afoot of the taxing agent, the federal government, as a taxing agent, and the way they were taxing the people, because there's no income tax yet, and until 1913. In other words, the federal government could not tax income. There's no federal income tax that was allowed in the Constitution.
That's why I've always argued with people online about, the unconstitutionality of, of all these social programs we got, and about socialism. They say, well, that's what the founders, some of the founders were socialists. And I go, well, since they didn't, and you just go right to that. I mean, they didn't have a way of gathering income enough from the people, or money enough, revenue enough from the people to actually sustain a program like that. They didn't have the way to distribute other people's money to other people, because they didn't have electronic data and all that stuff going on. So, and they didn't have the personal income tax. So how can these people actually legitimately make that claim? I'd like to know that.
One of the things that they'll never say is that in the check and balance system, they always talk about separation of powers, and they talk about the check and balance system. They never say that one way, a third way of restraining government. And so then those were two ways in which they tried to restrain government. One was separation of powers through the three branches of government, and then the check and balance system, where each part of the government in the federal level couldn't check on the other two branches, each branch checking on other branches of government. They don't say that another way that the framers tried to restrain government, because they understood the dangers of it, was to control its purse strings. And that's why they had no direct taxation of the federal government that was allowed by the states did not allow the federal government to have a direct tax on the American people. Therefore, the tariff was a way that the federal government was able to acquire its income. The problem is that the Constitution requires for the equal taxation of the people. You can't have one part of the country regionally benefiting from the taxation placed on another part of the country, and that's what the South is objecting to. And that is what James Ronald Kennedy is talking about, and his brother Walter Donald Kennedy. That's what they're talking about in terms of the South was right. It is not to say slavery was right, and people should stop allowing themselves to be pushed into these corridors where one is just automatically thought of is one hand washing the other, so that is automatically thought of as saying the South was right, so therefore slavery was right, when they are two different entities. Here's what they say on the front, on the jacket, on the front cover of the book: the South was right. Much of Civil War history is untrue. Like most history, it is written by the victor. And we always hear that, but we don't hear the corollary to it. The corollary is that, yeah, history is written by the victor, but it is written so as to be acceptable to the politicians. If not, it's not taught. The book goes on to say the story told is that millions of Southern men went to war over an issue that only affected 6% of the population. Such absurdity is readily seen. The deception must not continue. And it is an absurdity because you're saying that all of the South went to war over an institution that only 6% of the Southern population practiced, and that makes no sense. In other words, people are fighting for the benefit of another rather than fighting for their own benefit. And that's just another indication of how incorrect this whole notion is that fighting a civil war. There's no civil war fought in this country. We've had 2 wars of secession that was fought. And really, if you say that the War of 1776 was not a civil war, when it was separating, the 13 colonies were separating from Great Britain, then if that is not a civil war, then how is this war, which is also a war of secession, a civil war? It's not. So it's not a civil war. It is a war of secession. And because they are succeeding because of the inappropriate taxation that was placed upon the South to the benefit of the North, the South is picking up its arms against it. And Lincoln is making it very clear that they are not going to be allowed to do that. As far as the slaves is concerned, go read his inaugural address on Monday, March the 4th, 1861, and see in there that Lincoln had no problem with slavery where it already existed. But if they were going to have their slavery, they're going to have their slavery inside the Union, and they were not going to be allowed to take their states outside the Union where the taxation would be prohibited because it would be a separate nation. Lincoln was not going to allow that upon these shores, and there were 700,000 lives that were spent as a way of bringing the result about that they would be brought back into the taxation agency and would not be allowed to separate themselves as another country where their taxation goes elsewhere. All those soldiers out there on that battlefield they were fighting on the Union side were out there as tax agents. They're not calling them that, but that's what it amounts to. And you have the same thing going on whenever you go to the stores and things and buy things, whether it's groceries or you spending money. All those persons that are there in those stores are tax collecting agents. Along with the goods that you are buying, there's a tax on additional costs added on to it, and that makes those proprietors of those businesses tax agents of the government, both state and federal. They're tax collectors. But you're not supposed to see that, and just as you're not supposed to see why Trump tariffs should matter to you. And what they're doing there with the tariff, this steel and aluminum tariff, quite frankly, is that they just transfer the taxes from the American people to their children, and therefore there's a revenue shortage in terms of the taxation. Okay, we are now going to take a break from 92.1. We'll see you in 4 minutes from that studio, and we will have you come back at that time in about 4 minutes. I want to thank you for staying tuned. Those of you who are with us here at allpointstv.com, we don't take a break here for the hour. We just simply stay here and try to stay focused on what we're doing with multiple topics today. And we're going to try to tie all of it together at the end, because all this is to an extent tied together. Right now, I wanted to just simply bring in this point, though, that the South was right in its standing up for the ability, for its right not to be unfairly taxed in this country to the advantage of another part of the country. They were acting constitutionally by, in fact, resisting that. Starting, you first see it in 1828 with the tariff called the Tariff of Abomination that South Carolina would object to, because most of the goods coming into the South are coming in through the Charleston Harbor. That's why Fort Sumter is so important, Fort Sumter being a federal fort. And it is there as a military part of the tax collecting agency in South Carolina. And South Carolina is very pivotal to the South's economy. And so it has a built-in reason for its objection to the taxation inequity, because it is a harbor to which a lot of the goods are coming in, and therefore they have to collect the imports in that harbor of goods coming into the South. And at the same time, they're being detrimentally treated by the fact that they are exporting cotton out of that harbor. So they are being taxed by goods coming into the country. There's a taxation that is being assessed, and then the goods being exported are being taxed again on goods that's being exported. The government, by the way, could not, when I say export, I mean when they export it from this country, by them being therefore imported into a foreign country, they're being taxed at the harbors of those recipient countries. So all the cotton that's being exported is being taxed once imported in those countries that are retaliating, because when you tax goods coming into this country, then the countries that you're taxing will retaliate against you in terms of you exporting goods to their country. And so who is paying for it? Well, this article says this: why Trump tariffs should matter to you. It should matter because you're paying a tax through the tariff. It's just not directly placed upon you. It's placed upon the goods that are made higher of cost by the import. And so the federal government, which reaps the benefit of that tax, is reaping it by the fact that it is taxing the goods, and that tax is passed on to the consumer. So you're paying a tax to the federal government indirectly. So they're taking. So in other words, when the federal government claimed that it did, what is it called? It calls it tax reform. They're reforming taxes. Now, if you take the taxes and you in fact pass it on to the deficit of the country, and so you add, if you don't cut, see, here's the way it works. If you don't cut programs out, if you don't take the government's size and reduce it so that the cost of government is less than it was before you did the tax reform, that's what they call it, tax reform, and you don't cut anything, then if the cost of government is $4 trillion and you're taking in $3.27 trillion, and out of that you reduce, they say you reduce taxes. It's impossible. Can you see that it's impossible to reduce taxes under that particular premise? You can't reduce taxes unless you cut costs. Okay, we're glad to have you back. We're not too far from where we were when you left 4 minutes ago, and glad to have you back at 92.1. But can't you see that if you will do tax reform, you're going to reform taxes, right? How can you reform taxes when you're already spending above the amount of taxation that you're taking in? You're taking in $3.27 trillion a year. Now, that's enough to fund any government that is, in fact, legitimately involved in its expenditures. If you had the federal government carrying out its calling under Article 1, Section 8 in the enumeration of powers and those 18 clauses of that particular part of the Constitution, you would be able to pay for the government and have money left over in a surplus every year to pay for all the roads and all the other things that the government should be doing, pay for the national defense. All of that can be taken care of by that $3.27 trillion.
Well, see, the thing is, it was the people in power. I don't know if they're actually motivated out of real good, genuine concern for other people's welfare in other countries. But I mean, let's face it, if you look at the amount of money we borrow so we can give to other countries,
yes,
and at an interest rate, because we're borrowing from other countries to give to other countries, when we don't have that, we have deficits, we have all kinds of issues here, we can't finance here, yet we want to feel generous and paying tribute. The only way I could say it, foreign aid's tribute to me. I don't see how we can sum it up other way, because it doesn't go for the intended purposes in those countries that we're supposed to be sending it to. It's going to some fat cat bureaucrat or some some kind of presidente or something like that, and it never goes to the intended purpose that we're sending it there for, allegedly. So I mean, at what point though? How can we stop all this? I mean, I'd like to know that.
John, they're very clever. They would like the American people to believe that the amount of debt they have is because they're borrowing money from the Chinese, and they're borrowing money from Japan, and borrowing money from other parts of the world. That's not true. The borrowing is from the American people. In other words, when they print this right here, I'm holding up here a dollar bill, the United States of America. It says at the top of it, and they're saying it in code words. They're saying at the very top of this dollar bill, it is a dollar bill, B-I-L-L. When you have a bill, are they sending you money? Give me a break. When they send you a bill, you get a bill from consumers, right, every month. When they send you a bill, is that money? Okay, this is a dollar bill. Now, at the top of it, it says something else. Again, it's in code. It is a Federal Reserve note. Okay. How many of you have a car note? Is that money? You see, they talk in code. That's how clever they are.
Should they say currency on there? I mean, or
John, I tell you the word it would not have on there. It won't have M-O-N-E-Y. Try to find it on this dollar bill. Try to find the word money. It's not money. It is a Federal Reserve note. Let me read some other parts of it to you for translation purposes. John, in order to translate it, because it's written in code. It says, this note. Now, it didn't say this money. Because if it's money, you don't have to say that if it's money. This is what it says here. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Now, that's code in terms of saying it's a note. So you know what a note is, right? A note is debt. You got a car note? Okay, that's debt, right? So it says this note. So when they say this note, what are they saying? They're saying this debt. It's the same thing when you have a car note, right? So when they say this note, they're saying this debt. Okay, keep with me here for a minute. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Okay, fine. What does that mean? You got two guesses. Okay, time's up. Time's up. It means that when you carry this dollar bill to the proprietor, but let me make it a little clearer than that. when you take this note, when you take this Federal Reserve note, because it's issued by the government, you see a note that's issued by the Consumer Power, or your bank note, your if you owe the bank some money, your note to the bank, or your car note, your house note, is not, they're not going to say here that this debt that you have, you can simply print some paper and pay it to them, because it's not backed up by what? It's not backed up by the military apparatus of the state. So when they say this note is legal tender, what they're talking about here, folks, is they're talking about the government's force. And they're telling the proprietor, this note, this debt, that's what this dollar bill is debt, is legal tender for all debts, public and private. And it tells the proprietor that you will take this debt, this note, this Federal Reserve note, we're talking about force here, you'll take this Federal Reserve note, or you'll go to jail. Take this debt to any proprietor and let him tell you that he is not going to accept this note, this debt, because a note is debt, for the goods and services that you're purchasing at any of the proprietors, and I guarantee you the state will be there with its military apparatus to enforce the taking of this junk. So when you say that we're borrowing money from the foreign countries, they don't have any money either.
That's right. I was always wondering about that. It's a really interesting thing too. I'm a libertarian, so I used to sit around talking to other libertarians. Several years ago, when they had the Occupy Wall Street group going on in different cities, including Flint, I would sat down and talk to them. And here, as diverse as these people are, it's poles apart. The libertarians and the Bernie Sanderites and all that, and all these Occupy people. The one thing they had in common was this real hatred for the Federal Reserve. Left and right had this real hatred for the Federal Reserve. Mm-hmm. And lately I've been I got a book, I haven't finished reading it, I have just got into it. It's called Positive Money. And basically it eliminates the Federal Reserve, and most people don't know what it is, because it's basically a handful of individuals with marginal oversight in our Congress to see if they're qualified. They run our economy, they print the money, they charge us interest on the money they release to the banks. They send it to the banks, and the banks, they pay an interest on it, and in turn they also increase what we pay to get a loan from them. And this positive money, allegedly, the approach they want to use, and it's been argued heavily in England. I mean, in Parliament, they're always discussing this. But you don't see the Federal Reserve being approached as vehemently here as you would the Central Bank of England. I don't know. I think a large portion of it's because certain people, certain groups of people have more connections to it, and they want to be called, bigoted or whatever. So I think that's what it is. Right. But the Federal Reserve on both sides, left and right, just has this vehement hatred towards the Federal Reserve, and it has pitted people against each other. Mm-hmm. And it has. The bankers are hard to like anyway. But I mean, because the bank, let's face it, they sit on money. But the Federal Reserve System basically has enslaved everybody.
Yeah, they have. John, what you have here is you have anti-money. In other words, now, and when I say anti-money, what do I mean by that? Debt is anti-money. Debt is anti-money. And so therefore, if this is not money, then what is it? It's debt. See, debt is anti-money. And so if you have this in your wallet, they'll ask in that one commercial, they'll say, what's in your wallet? Well, if you have that one credit card, I'm not going to mention on the air, but this one credit card, if you have that credit card in your wallet, then you have debt. And I'll tell you about the difference in that debt and the other debt you have. You have two forms of debt in your pocket, in your wallet. One form of debt is your credit card. And the other form of debt is this note, these dollar bills at different dimensions, denominations, such as the $1 bill, the $5 bill, the $10 bill. If you say the $3 bill, you say that's counterfeit. All of this is counterfeit. It's all counterfeit. You can't print money on a printing machine. And that's what the framers were aware of in terms of limiting money to specie.
Because the Constitution, Congress has a right to coin coins,
money.
not print money.
That's right. See, they were very specific in it because they understood government goes out of control. If you can print money in a printing press, then government would in fact begin to create all kinds of money out here, quote unquote, and what you do is inflate the currency. The fact of the matter is that government is a theft institution. And because it doesn't create anything on its own, so all of the so-called money that is out there printed by the government is nothing other than the government stealing money. And the more it prints, the more wealth it steals from the taxpayers. In other words, whenever they print money, when they go to the printing press and print more and more money, what they're doing is they're stealing more and more of the people's wealth by inflating the currency. In other words, the government is able to counterfeit the currency that is in fact created by printing more of it, because what it does when you print more and more of it, you in fact counterfeit the currency already out there by reducing its value. So all inflation is government theft. And you go to the store and you find and how do the manufacturers, the ones that are actually producing wealth, called robber barons, by the way, the robber barons are the politicians. John, the robber barons are the politicians.
Well, see, they all point out to the guys who are engaged in business, but money, the people they get money from to do what they want to do, they do their bidding. They'll say, look at those robber barons. The guy just paid me a few $1,000s, a few $100,000 in my bank account. Yeah, he's a robber baron. What the hell are you? I mean, what are you? You're a congressman, senator, just took money from these people, do their bidding, and then you're pointing the finger at them. I mean, you guys aren't even being good little sneaks. I mean, you're not.
Guess who created the term robber barons? The real robber barons that were doing a diversion and distracting people from the real robbers, which are the politicians that are taking wealth under the auspices of having the guns and the only legal right to use them by the initiation of force. The government is the only force that can initiate force legally.
Look at the guys who become politicians. Usually a person, they're psychopaths, but they also go to college and they usually have a political science background, so they know how to how effectively lie and how to use lies and propaganda, and how other people have gotten away with it. You know, that's the reason why they study their predecessors. And then they basically look good in suits, and then for the price of a 4-year degree, often, but maybe if they go to college for other things, they can actually have their hands in your pockets for 3 generations after they go through this. So, I mean, they don't have to provide anything that's actually workable, something you desire, and they can have this perpetuated. Their kids are going to be picking up on it, and their grandkids. You
made a point last week in the program that they are terrible, and that is a correct assessment of these people. These people are most of them, if not all, and I would be leaning more toward all. These people are psychopaths. The very fact that they pursue power makes them a psychopath, because the pursuit of power, which is to pursue influence in the lives of other people, is what government is really about. And those that join on to it, by the very definition of their pursuit of power, makes them psychopathic. And that includes Donald Trump. You know, the people think, you know, when I make these analyses of these people in the political order, once you join into it, then you become psychopathic yourself, because you cannot be a part of the apple cart in a barrel of spoiled apples and not be a part of that yourself. In other words, it rubs off on anyone that individuates itself into that process. And we see all kinds of signs of it, of Donald Trump, whose basic reason for being there is because the American people were looking for someone that was not one of these psychopathic politicians. So they went to the outside, but you see the contradiction is, on the outside you go out there and bring somebody from the outside on the inside, and then the question is what happens there. And we see what happens there.
See, basically, I look at the two parties as two lions contending over a body, a carcass they found in the middle of the wilderness,
Yep.
and they're basically hate any interlopers. That's what it is.
That's what it is.
They don't have any moral superiority.
No.
They've already got it divvied up, and then somebody else is coming saying, challenging that. That's the reason we got this fierceness and protect. It's about protection. They're the reactionaries.
Yeah, they Abraham Lincoln is used. You see, you have to ask yourself the question: what would be the purpose of this myth of Abraham Lincoln? This man supposedly was fighting a war. What politician do you know acts this way, that he initiated a war because he was so torn by the fact that we had slavery in this country, that it existed for 242 years. If you start at 1619, for 242 years, between 1619 and 1861, all of a sudden he's torn, and the North was torn by having slavery within his midst. It had in his midst ever since the founding of the nation, starting with indentured servants. And all of a sudden the nation is torn by having slavery in one part of the country. You have to be brainwashed to believe that nonsense. And that's what the candidates are getting at. The South was right, but it does not mean that slavery was right. Slavery was wrong. But it was wrong all over the world at this time. And to indict the framers for trying to find a solution to government's largesse, they were trying to find an answer to it. They saw what had happened in history. They saw what Volney had written in his book called The Ruins of Empire. And what had ruined each of those empires was the same thing that's running this country: politicians. And people don't know how insulting it is to, when I talk to them about the different things, and they want to say Republican my foot. Are you kidding? It's an insult to label what I'm talking about as being in one of these two corrupt parties. Both of them are pariahs. I don't identify with any party. In fact, when I see a politician on television, I turn it off. I don't care about anything these psychopaths talk about. And it's impossible to be a politician in Washington and not be a psychopath. Let me give an example of that right now, since we are talking about the South was right, but I want to do it in the context of some of the things that occurred within the purview of that. Go watch this program that's on CNN, not CNN because CNN had some other good things. The Kennedy Dynasty was one of the programs they did over there, and they had a very good program. I said 2 weeks ago, Charles Barkley was on the Axe Files, and I mean, brought some points we need to discuss. And that was the program that we did 2 weeks ago. So that was interesting. Sometimes they have some good programs on these Lang stations, these FCC licensed indoctrination stations, where if they don't toe the line of the rulers, they ain't gonna be out there. And they get ready to bring in Zuckerberg so that he can go up there and understand that your role is to be out here a certain way, and if you're not out here a certain way, you're gonna be called in, and that's what this is about. They're not trying to get him to stop doing some things he's doing as far as censoring speech in this country, which is what he's doing. They want him to understand that they are the ones ultimately in control of the process. And if he didn't get in line to understand that, no matter how much power he has accrued in terms of owning Facebook, then he's going to have some problems here, because there are some above him, and that's why they're bringing him in to let him understand he got the total line. But if you want to deal with, we're talking about these kleptocrats. If you want to deal with these people in Washington, I'm going to tell you right now, you're dealing with psychopaths, and they are no exception to the rule. Donald Trump has already shown that he has gone into Washington, and they have gobbled him up into the process, as can be seen by them sending him this bill over there. They dared him not to sign it. This $1.3 trillion additional taxation on our children, called the Omnibus bill, and he signed it because they threw some things in there that if he doesn't sign it, then he is therefore not giving the military They put $700 million in there for the military, and this man was talking about he's going to make sure the veterans are taken care of. He's going to build the military. If he doesn't forego that, then he is refuting his own claim to build a military. So he put that in there. You see how they do their business there. By putting some caveats in there, they'll trip him up in terms that he's promised if he does not do it. They put the other stuff in there, which was this other junk in there, $500 million, for example, for Planned Parenthood. They got $500 million to kill children in this country. And that's what abortion is. I was reading an article, by the way, on that point. I was reading an article before I came to the studio. It was talking about they want to pass a law. Get this hypocrisy now. They want to pass a law for those parents who want to abort their children if they find out that they have an additional chromosome that creates autism or Down syndrome. They may want to pass a law that would prohibit persons from aborting their children because they carry certain traits that the parents don't like. They want to end the abortion of those in the abortion of those children when the parents find out they have a trait that they don't like and disapprove of and don't want to have a child having that condition. They want to make it impossible illegally to do those abortions. Of course, if you object to the whole child, there's no problem. If you object to the child being born for any other reason, that's fine. I mean, these politicians are insane. We're dealing with psychopaths. And to label anybody as either one of these two corrupt groups in this country is a label of people as part of the psychopathic disorder of the political leaders of this country. And the South was one of the ones that stood up against it, and they were right in terms of exercising the Second Amendment to refute and to repudiate and defend themselves against these criminals. And that's why the South is right. Slavery was wrong. Standing up to these criminals was right. And they're teaching that Abraham Lincoln was some kind of great emancipator. Prove it by the documentation. It's impossible to prove it by the documentation because the documentation proves otherwise. And you can have these historians like Stephen Oates, who's written some very good books, by the way, but Stephen Oates is a liar. In his book called, I'm not pouring water on all his work. He has a book out called Let the Trumpet Sound, which is a very, very good book on King and the Civil Rights Movement. And it's not a bad book in terms of some of the information in the book they wrote called With Malice Toward None, but I take exception to a book called With Malice Toward None, which he took out of the last paragraph of Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, which is dishonest, because he makes it seem to be in Lincoln's first inaugural address, which, as I told you earlier, was Monday, March the 4th, 1861, where Lincoln did not mention with malice toward none in that speech. With malice toward none was after the 4-year war. It was winding down at that point. Lincoln's second inaugural address was March 4th, 1865. The war came to an end April the 14th. So 1 month later, the war ends, and Lincoln talks about with malice toward none in his second inaugural address, and there are 700,000 people laying out there on the battlefield. You give me a break and give me a witness to what the Kennedy brothers said. Much of Civil War history is untrue. And you don't just get it from the Kennedy brothers. Go and read Lerone Bennett's book, the same one that wrote the book called Before the Mayflower. Since blacks came here in 1619, the Mayflower did not arrive in these shores until 1620. The book is called Before the Mayflower. And he's making a point that blacks were here before the Pilgrims arrived in this country. They arrived on the Mayflower in 1620. So 1 year before that, you had the blacks brought here on a Dutch ship in 1619. And so they preceded the Pilgrims, although the settlement of Jamestown had occurred in 1607. Named after James I, who was the first of the Tudor rulers who ruled England from 1603 to 1625. And they don't want to talk about this next king, the one that came in as Charles I, who was there from 1625 to 1649. They don't want to talk about Charles I, who was the second of the Tudor rulers, because they cut his head off. And they cut his head off, and they decapitated him, and sent him to what later on become like the guillotine in France because of taxation in England. That's not written anywhere, is it? But that was the reason why they rose up against Charles the First, who was beheaded. He was a king of England from 1625 to 1649. He was beheaded in 1649, and that was because of taxation as well. We're not going to get through all of this, but I want you to be aware here that we have been captured in this country by the politicians who are totally out of control. And we're going to continue this discussion next week, because I want to get into what they're doing now in terms of this new lie they just told about Syria. Because they're not only psychopaths, they are warmongering psychopaths. And we are tied together with King and with this war that they're getting ready to engage in. I don't know how wide it's going to be, depending upon how Syria and how Russia responds to it. But these warmongers in here are getting ready to create an action in Syria over this nonsense they just created this past weekend. We'll talk about it next week. Until that time, I want you to follow your dreams. Because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.